Hello. There it goes. My name is Jeff, and this is Ray, and we are Skull Theater. So we came up from, short. No, make do. We came up from Seattle today to talk a little bit about the art for the game that we're working on called Rustclad. So we're doing some different things, and we think some of the work that we're doing might be very interesting to others in the indie space. Rustclad is an adventure game, still really early on in development. But the basic idea is that it tells the story of this robot that wakes up in a world that's completely different from anything that he remembers, and he sort of sets out to discover what happened in his absence, and in doing so, he has the ability to change himself and incorporate elements of the environment into himself to solve puzzles and whatnot. So the exploration aspect, since it's an adventure game and it's a large open world, we wanted the exploration aspect and the world to be a major part of our game. So we wanted a strong sense of visuals. And also from the beginning, we really wanted to make a 3D game, and we just wanted this rich environment that you could explore. But making a 3D game as an indie team on an indie budget is really hard for a lot of reasons. So the basic problem with, there's a lot of reasons why 3D is hard, but one of the major issues is art. So the basic problems with that is that 3D modeling is really expensive. A single mile license will set you back a couple $1,000s, which isn't very indie friendly. And it can also be very time consuming to do, since you have to model and texture all of your assets. That takes a lot of time. And it also requires a really unique set of skills. Modelers get good at what they're doing through years of experience and whatnot. And it's a hard thing to jump right into. So we looked at a lot of solutions for this problem early on, and tried a bunch of different things because we really wanted to make a 3D game. And one of the things that we had a lot of success with early on is this technique called photogrammetry. And so the basic idea of photogrammetry is that you take a whole bunch of photos of a physical object, and you can then build a textured model from those photos. And if you can use a photogrammetry tool, the process is really simple. You basically just build your art by hand, and you take a series sich photos of it and put it through this tool, and all of a sudden, you got art.
Just like that.
Just like that. Yeah, so that's sort of a reiteration of what I just said. But yeah, it lets you build your game by hand, which is awesome. So photogrammetry isn't a particularly new thing. It's been around for a while, and the film industry has been using it for a good long time. A classic example is The Matrix, when Neo's in bullet time. Basically, we have a little slide of that. But basically, they use photogrammetry to sort of capture him from all angles, and then they can just insert him into a 3D scene. The setup they have here is kind of awesome. It's a giant photogrammetry room. I think they have 360 cameras that capture every single facet of Neo from every single angle. And so obviously this isn't a very indie-friendly setup. But the cool thing is that lately a lot of the tools that do this kind of stuff have become really approachable and really affordable to anyone who wants to try it, which is what we noticed and why we jumped in on it. You can basically do something not nearly this sophisticated, but the same basic idea for practically nothing. All you really need is a camera. So we spent a lot of time experimenting with that to see what we could do. And a couple months ago, we put together sort of a real quick early art style video of just kind of some of the things that we've been able to incorporate into a game world using photogrammetry. So I'd just like to share that with you guys. Yeah. And it's just this isn't necessarily representative of what Rustclad will finally look like. We're still really early on in development, but this is just kind of an example of some of the things we've been able to do so far. You know what? I'm just going to do it this way. There's music, and I like the music. So. Highly technical solution here. All right.
That's right. Indie style. Can you hear that at all?
So yeah, that's all of the models in that were all either built by hand or found. So some might be wondering if this is just a totally different, this is going to completely change how video games are made. And the short answer is no. The tools are still a long ways off. It's amazing what you can do already, but there's a lot of room for improvement, and they require a certain amount of finesse to really get good results. It's hard to model complex objects with them. You kind of need to work on a much simpler scale and add the complexity back in your game, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we do for that later. Translucent and reflective objects can be a real big problem. You basically have to make them not translucent and not reflective, and do the capture and then add all that back in at a later time. And also, it's still a lot of work to make art by hand. In some cases, it's more work. In a lot of ways, it doesn't really solve the art problem. It just kind of changes the art problem. But it happens that it changes it in a way that tends to work really well for an indie team. So basically, why is this good for indies? It's cheap. All you really need to do to get started is just have a camera. The program that we use to do this is 123D Catch by Autodesk. There's a couple other programs out there, but we've had really good results with that. One of the best things about it is that it's free right now, which is our favorite price. It's in beta, and they reserve the right to charge at some point, but right now you could use it for free. It's nice in a lot of ways. They do all of the processing, the building of your model off on their servers. So your computer's basically free to do whatever you want with it while you're waiting for the results, and they come back really fast, which is nice. But anyway, you can work with classical artists, which is a great thing. It just expands the audience of artists that you can, or the number of artists that you can pull from becomes much larger, which is always a good thing. And you also incorporate a lot of the style of the artist that you work with. A lot of that, the hand-done art, all kind of has a little bit of a unique style from each individual artist, and a lot of that translates through to the final product, which is really cool. And you can use found art, which is huge. A huge number of things that we have in our game are just things that we put zero creative energy into, and basically just noticing them and seeing that they would be cool and would be a good thing to have in the game, and just picking it up and then bringing it in, and all of a sudden it's there. So I want to show a few of the things that we've found and brought in. This is our hoard. We've done our part to clean up the beaches of Seattle. And our game's called Rustclad, so you can imagine we want a lot of rusty bits and whatnot throughout the game world. So here are some of the models that we brought in from some of the rusty things that we've captured and whatnot. It's a pretty good representation of the object. And you can also get pretty good results from man-made objects too. Here are a few other things that we found that we just brought in. There's a planter, and I think that's a car jack. I'm not sure. Or whatever. Brick, things. And you can also do natural objects. There's a lot of mushrooms around the area, and mushrooms capture really well. I think if you're trying to do something a little more delicate than that, you might have some trouble, but mushrooms are nice and thick, so you can usually get and they have a beautiful texture on them, so you can just get really good results from them, and pieces of wood and whatnot. But by far the things we've gotten the best results from are rocks and whatnot, because they have such a great texture and a great shape. Here are some of the rocks we've captured. There's some really good representations of them, and we just picked them up and scanned them, and now they're game assets. So I'm going to pass it over to Ray for a bit to talk about some of the tips and tricks that we've learned through this process, and things that we've found to make it easier.
So I don't know how many artists are actually here today, but we just wanted to share some of the things that we learned working with 123D Catch. This is sort of a how-to, some tips. It's not completely exhaustive. I'm just going to share some of the most important things that we learned. So when it comes to when you're actually creating and sculpting objects, not using the found objects that you're going to scan in, you want to obey a couple rules. Number one, you want to keep the things that you're building very simple. So you don't want to have anything too complex, or it's really not going to scan in very well. But you do want to go for textural variation. So anything that's too symmetrical or too smooth or too shiny is not going to capture very well. You want cracks and ridges and mottled color and just anything to make this not a perfectly smooth object. As Jeff mentioned earlier, things that are too shiny don't really scan very well, so you want to avoid that shininess. And this is something that you can add back in later. One of the things that we found helps in terms of keeping shininess down is, because sometimes if you're painting something with acrylics, it's going to be shiny no matter what you do. You take some cornstarch or you take some baby powder and a makeup brush and you just powder it down before you take it to the photograph studio, and that works really well. Another thing is you want to keep size in mind when you're building an object. If anybody's experimenting with this, whatever setup you build is going to dictate what size you can capture. But for the setup that we have, we noticed that anything things should not be any smaller than a golf ball, and they should not be any larger than a bread box. This is just a general thing. If you experiment, you might find that you can capture things larger or smaller than that. And some tips for the actual photography part of this. You want to use even neutral lighting. And the reason for this is you want to be able to alter your lighting in the game later to change it or make it however you want for your own aesthetic. So you want to start with neutral lighting when you're photographing your object. Another tip is that standard incandescent bulbs just suck. You can't use those. They're way too red. And of course, this is going to break that first rule of neutral lighting if it has too much of a red cast to it. So we recommend that you use fluorescent day bulbs, or CFL lights as they're called. And another tip is you want to busy up the scene in your photography studio, however you have it built. We found that 123D Catch has a hard time distinguishing between the object you're trying to photograph and what it's sitting on. So you want to make sure that you give it some tips on how to figure that out. And one thing that worked for us was we just took a bunch of colored magic markers and just scribbled all over the foundation that the object was sitting on the drop cloth curtains that are in the photo studio, and that seemed to work pretty well. The last thing is you want to take a certain amount of photographs if you're using 123D Catch, about 48 to 64, 2 to 3 circuits around the object. This is our extremely DIY photo studio here in our basement. I think it scared the landlord a little bit the first time she saw it. She's like, what is this, Dexter? What the hell are you guys doing down there? And so what you see here is we have a stationary table there, and then this camera rig moves around it. So we have a single camera, and we take shots in circuits around the object, and there's the little model house there in the center. And the shaft there can be moved in and out from the table to allow for close-up shots or far-away shots. And we have 3 camera mounts. We usually end up taking photographs from just about 2 of those mounts, not all 3. And we found that they're a little bit far apart the way that you see them in the photograph. So if you're experimenting with this, we suggest you try to move them a little close together if you're building a rig like this. And of course, the most important thing there is we have a kick-ass skull on the top of it for skull theater. You're going to be spending a lot of back-breaking time hunched over this thing, so you want to give your rig some personality. And this whole setup, including the lights, the drop cloths, the pieces that we use to build the rig, cost us under $200. So, and we found most of the pieces at our local hardware store, so very indie-friendly setup. Now, if you do have some money to play with, which if you're here, you probably don't, because you're an indie, you can do what Autodesk, the maker of 123D Catch, did, and you can have 56 cameras all set up around your object. And just stand there and press a button. And I wish we could do it this way, but we can't afford 56 cameras. So after you've captured your object, there are still some post-processing things that you want to do before you import it into your game. And this is the point where you're going to add your shininess back. So that object that you powdered down initially, you're going to make shiny. So if you're trying to have a metallic object or a glass object, this is when you can do that. And then you can import directly to most game engines like Unity. We'd like to do some other things to clean our objects up before we import into our game. We really don't have the time to describe all the things we did, but we've documented extensively all of our experiments on our blog, rustclad.com. So if you have any questions about that, you can check out our blog later. Again, we mentioned several times that you want to focus on capturing these very simple images, these simple objects, and then use the game to add complexity back in. And I'm going to just describe what that means. So basically, if you capture simple objects, you can then combine them together to create something that's a little more interesting. And the boon for this is that you can reuse objects. So instead of your artist having to build multiple unique models, they can basically build up a library of simple objects and then recombine them in different varied ways in the game. Sort of like Mr. Potato Head. You have a bunch of different eyes, a bunch of different mouths, and you can combine them together and make unique objects. Another interesting thing we've learned about doing it this way is that animation is a little bit easier. Because you're combining pieces together, it creates natural joints in your objects, so animation's a little bit easier for an indie team. And of course, again, if you're using these simple objects that you're scanning in, you're going to get much better color and textural results when you capture the object. And the last great thing about doing it this way is your artist can work on whatever scale they want to. So whatever they feel comfortable working in. If you're building a house, the door and the house can be exactly the same size when they're sculpting them, and you can scale up or scale down later when you're post-processing for the game. And here is a quick example of this combining of pieces together to create complex objects. These are two of the robot characters from our game. And none of their parts have been 3D modeled. This is all the captured objects. And their heads, their bodies, their eyes, everything were separate objects that we brought together to create these beings. And theoretically, we could rearrange all their pieces and make a third unique robot, save ourselves some labor. Here's another glamour shot of them hanging out on the beach. You can see a little bit here of those natural joints that I was talking about. We were able to pose them in these funny positions. So this is another example of combining objects together in terms of architecture. So you can see on the top we've got our library of simple objects that we've captured, like a door and the foundation building that's pretty much featureless. And then below, you can see how we've combined them together to create this piece of architecture. And again, we could change this into a new building by recombining the pieces. The building itself has been sunk into the ground to make it look shorter, but we could pull it up and make it a tower. There's a lot of options there. So I'm going to turn the mic back to Jeff.
So that's about it, actually. But just some final thoughts to leave you with if you're interested in trying this kind of stuff. First and foremost, be patient. It's really important. Like I mentioned, these tools are sort of in their infancy right now. And I guarantee you won't get the results you want the first time you use them. So try and try again. And along with that, consistency is really important too, because as you try different things, you're going to succeed and you're going to fail. And knowing what you did and having a kind of a consistent process will allow you to iterate on that and make little changes and basically hone in on a style that works for you. Good lighting, really important. If you're going to spend money on one thing, you don't need a super fancy camera for this, but having just a decent lighting is a much better way to spend your money, and you won't be spending a lot of it. And experiment. These techniques can do different things for different projects and figure out what works for you and with what you're trying to go for. We've been, like Ray mentioned, we've been putting a lot of information up on our blog. I've been trying to keep it up to date just with our, not just about the process, but about the game we're building too. So if you're either interested in photogrammetry or cool 3D adventure games, check out rustclad.com for lots more articles on our own experiences on this. These guys again. I think we have, do we have time for questions?
I don't know. What time?
Brian, do you have time for questions? We do. All right. Any questions?
I got one. Once you got all this set up, how long does it take you to get one of those bolts from the photograph studio into a usable model?
Not too long. I think it probably takes probably about 3 to 4 hours, but a lot of that time is spent waiting, and it's a very parallelizable process. Typically, when we do like a photo capture session, what we'll do is we'll gather up a whole bunch of objects at once, and so we'll just rip through a bunch of these objects. And the nice thing about 123D Catch is, like I mentioned, all of the processing is done off of your PC. So you can upload a bunch of different jobs all at once and get the results back. But basically, once you submit it to them, you'll get results back in 30 to 40 minutes. And then what we like to do is then resubmit it to get a higher resolution. Basically isolate the section of the scene that you're interested in working with and then resubmit it to get a higher resolution version of that. And then after that, we mentioned that we have a bunch of post-processing things we do. We have kind of an automated process where we basically like clean up the texture and reduce the complexity of the mesh so it's more friendly to a game environment and whatnot. But that runs pretty automated. So all in all, I'd say probably about 3 hours, but usually we can get through a couple objects all in that time.
Are these are the meshes and stuff exportable into Maya as well, so you can sort of touch nothing there?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Like we've been shying away from doing any 3D modeling really, but another really good way you could use this technique is use it as a base. You know, you could take an object, and even if you don't get perfect results, you could then take it. 123D Catch outputs to a bunch of different formats. OBJ format, pretty much everyone understands. So you could just export it to OBJ and then bring it into any 3D modeling tool you wanted to. I can't see if. Yeah.
You had said 48 to 64 photos. Now, if you have something more complex, would it be beneficial to load more? Or?
I don't think so. I think that the extra complexity. 48 to 64 basically just gives you good coverage around the whole object, and I don't think you're going to get any better results. And I think that, at least with 123D Catch, I think there's kind of an upper limit on how much information you can upload per capture. After that, I think you start getting degraded results. I can't see. I guess, yeah, that's it for us. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't see a thing. Go ahead.
Did I hear right that your camera rotates around your stage?
Yeah.
Why would you not do it where you have a turntable and the camera is fixed?
That's a great question. The reason is that you want a stable lighting environment when you capture. This is another reason why you can't have any shininess or reflectivity. You basically want the light on the surface of the object to stay consistent across your set of photos. So if you have the object on a turntable and you rotate the object, then the lighting is potentially going to change on the object as you turn the table around. I've heard of some people having decent luck with a turntable, but I think it's one of those things that maybe if you have like really, really even lighting, but we've got like 3 lights set up around our object, so our lighting is pretty neutral, but I think probably we'd see some degraded results from something like that. Yeah.
How does 123D Catch, if it just has a stable lighting environment, how does it like the other assets and stuff like the other side of the object?
You can. It's a hard thing to do. I think we've been sort of tailoring all of our captures towards objects that can have a natural bottom, and we use that. We mentioned we combine objects together to create more complex objects. But yeah, you are you don't have to have it on a table. We have had some luck with just sort of, positioning an object, like hanging something and kind of hovering it up. And there's no reason why you couldn't get a decent coverage around the entire surface of the object. But it's tricky. I think that we found that being able to put an object on a table and using objects that we can get away with actually like having on the table with a bottom to be good. We just kind of like, just sort of worked with objects that we didn't need to worry about that so much with. I can't see. Okay.